I regret to inform you all that the rumors are true. I am the Eggman. Not only am I the Eggman, I am also the Walrus. Cuckoo, cachoo. So welcome back, or welcome, if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the series where once a week I sit down and just talk about a classic album I love. If 20-minute episodes aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds, both here on my channel and over on my Instagram. So we usually play a game over on my community tab where I post a hint, whether it's an Easter egg in my clothes or a song title, a lyric, a release date, something like that. And from there, you guys would guess what album I'm covering. I had a gap in my schedule for this week, so I let you guys pick what album I was gonna talk about. This vote was really close, within like 2% or something stupid like that. This week, you guys picked Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles. It's not often that I do audience requested albums because then you just get tangled up in requests forever, and as great as that would be for you guys, it's hard to regulate on this end, on the production end. People who voted for Transformer, I am so sorry. I will be getting that to you very soon, I promise. But enough of the boring housekeeping stuff. Let's take the plastic off. So my copy is an original, at least I'm pretty sure it's an original. I'm definitely sure that this is a mono press. This album was issued in stereo and mono, and I just so happened to grab the mono one. The front cover mirrors the promotional art of the film Magical Mystery Tour, of course. That's where this collection of songs came from. And on the back, we have a nice little photo from set. On the inside of the gatefold, actually, you know what? I'm not gonna show you this in the A-roll. I'm just gonna let B-roll Abby do this because my booklet of all of the snapshots from the film and the story that goes with it, it's detached from the inside. So if I open it right now when I'm not being super careful, this whole thing could fall apart, and I just really don't want to deal with that today. On Magical Mystery Tour, of course, we have the Beatles. We have Paul McCartney on vocals, piano, bass, mellotron, and the recorder. John Lennon on vocals, guitar, piano, mouth organ, harpsichord, harmonica, banjo, Hammond organ, and mellotron. Fun fact, if Rod Argent is to be believed, I have no reason not to trust him, this is the same mellotron that was used on the Zombies Odyssey and Oracle. We've also got George Harrison on vocals, guitar, violin, various percussion, and Indian harp, and Ringo Starr on drums and various percussion. We've got a lot of guests on this one, so I'll just breeze through the big names. We have Mal Evans playing percussion on Strawberry Fields Forever, George Martin producing and also jumps in on piano for Penny Lane. Eddie Kramer, that's a name we hear a lot on this series. He plays vibraphone on Baby You're a Rich Man. The Mike Sam singers do guest vocals on I Am the Walrus. You might know them better from the old school Disney films they sang for. We've got Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, Patty Boyd, and many more doing backing vocals on All You Need Is Love. And we actually don't know who played the cello on Blue Jay Way. Yeah, as it so often goes on this series, from the Blonde on Blonde release to the Souvlaki release, the dubious presence of Brian Wilson's then wife on Pet Sounds, and so many more. Say it with me, guys. Nobody bothered to write it down. These songs were produced by George Martin, engineered by Jeff Emmerich and Ken Scott, and roll a super groovy transition. Alright, here is a big old disclaimer before I get into the story of Magical Mystery Tour. This is the busiest time in all of Beatles history. I'm gonna miss some stuff. This is one of the most well-documented bands in the world, so again, I'm gonna miss some stuff. It would be impossible to cover everything in the runtime of a Vinyl Monday, so instead, I'm going to be focusing on the most important events to the overall album. Some, of course, will tie into the film too. I want to thank Trevin for filling in all the gaps for me and giving me a fantastic chronological play-by-play of Magical Mystery Tour. This video probably wouldn't have happened without his Beatle knowledge. He knows more about the Beatles than the actual Beatles do. So with those disclaimers and thank yous done, let's dive into Beatle World in the summer of 1967. Recording the Magical Mystery Tour soundtrack stopped and started lots of times. For a time, the Beatles were flip-flopping between producing two movies, this one and Yellow Submarine. All the guys were on a lot of acid during this time, so some specifics are totally lost to the sands of time and also drugs. Magical Mystery Tour in earnest takes shape a lot later in this timeline. What would become the soundtrack has its beginnings with Strawberry Fields Forever. As a boy, John would climb a tree outside the Salvation Army orphanage, named Strawberry Field for its red gates, to gather his thoughts. He'd play in the gardens with his friends and see the Salvation Army band play there in the summer. It was a great source of comfort for him in his childhood. These memories were a perfect backdrop for a song about having existential crises on LSD. Gotta love a good ego death. Speaking of ego death, while recording these songs, John has the worst trip of his life. He has to go sit on the roof of EMI for an hour to gather his bearings, and I can't help but wonder if this incident was what planted the seed for the rooftop concert a few years later. But we're nowhere near there yet. John starts writing Strawberry Fields Forever while filming How I Won the War in '66. He plays it for the guys in November, and they all agree to work on it for possible inclusion on Sgt. Pepper's. Side note, I know you people hate that I call it Sgt. Pepper's with the S, but if it's good enough for Neil Halstead, it's good enough for me. Recording Strawberry Fields, though, proved to be problematic. John wrote it in C. It's re-recorded lots of times with different tempos, and while George Martin and Jeff are at a movie premiere, the guys completely overhaul the backing track. This is where the backwards drums and cranberry sauce came from. You can imagine George's face when he heard that little surprise. Martin works in the whack shit the guys came up with. They record it some more, but John still isn't happy. That is, until take 26. He hears it, loves it, and decides on the spot that take 7 was just as good. Martin tells John, "Alright, buddy, it's time. You gotta pick which one you like best so we can mix this song." John says something like, "Why not both?" After Martin speeds the tape up a couple different ways to get the takes to match, Strawberry Fields ends up somewhere around B flat. That's a very loose approximation. People have written entire video essays on this website of what key Strawberry Fields Forever is in. And around this time of Sgt. Pepper's production, Paul and John meet Marika Koger and her partner Simone Postuma. They were these fantastical bohemians moving around from place to place, these painters who were just about as psych could get. Teamed up with another couple, Yasha Leager, and their manager, Barry Finch, they called themselves The Fool. They play a big role in Beatles history throughout 67 and 68. You're gonna hear their names come up a lot more in this video. Strawberry Fields ends up being the Sgt. Pepper's single backed with Penny Lane. The avant-garde music video, directed by Peter Goldman, plants the seed in Paul's brain for another film. The Magical Mystery Tour film, the vehicle for which this music was delivered, has its origins in Paul's trip to the US. His girl Jane Asher is there working on Romeo and Juliet, and he plans to surprise her for her birthday. Aww. But before that, Paul and Mal Evans swing out to California. There, they have a jam session with Jefferson Airplane? Well, those are a group of people I would never put in the same room. He learns about the Merry Pranksters, a bus full of acid-taking mischief makers, and he likens it to the Beach Town Mystery Bus tours back in England. They're similarly merry affairs, with drinking and big bands, and Paul also remembers, hey, we have some decent leftover material from the Sgt. Pepper's sessions. And boom, Magical Mystery Tour is born. Before he goes home, he drops by Brian Wilson's place in Beverly Hills. He borrows a piece of paper and a pen to outline the Magical Mystery Tour concept and choose celery. This will make sense in about 3 months. Like Pepper's was very much a Paul project, Magical Mystery Tour was pretty much entirely spearheaded by Paul. George later makes the rounds in California with his wife Patty Boyd. While waiting around for one of their friends, they were running very late, George starts singing, "Please don't be long. Please don't you be very long." He held on to that hook and transformed it into Blue Jay Way. Come June 1st, Sgt. Pepper's is released and turns the world upside down. The Beatles make another big splash on the world stage about 4 weeks later. On June 25th, they take part in the Our World broadcast, where they record All You Need Is Love live. Well, kind of. The backing track with the big brass band and everything, that was done beforehand, and overdubs were added in a little after. The whole thing was staged to look like the Beatles just working away in the studio, when in reality it was this highly choreographed production. Believe me when I say there were so many things that could have gone wrong with this. For starters, George Martin was stressed as hell. His father had passed a couple days before, his wife was gonna give birth any day now, so he gets drunk with Jeff Emmerich. There was a full orchestra to handle and a huge audience in EMI Studios, including but not limited to Mal Evans, Jane Asher, and Patty Boyd. Eric Clapton was there with his girlfriend at the time, Charlotte Martin. He stared at Patty the entire time. Charlotte soon left him for Jimmy Page. Mick J and his girl Marianne Faithfull were there. Keith Richards was there too. The Fool were there. They designed the clothes that the Beatles wore in the broadcast. Keith Moon was there. The Small Faces were there. Even Graham Nash was in town. If I'm not mistaken, this was how Graham Nash met the Fool, and he ended up producing their album. There were a lot of moving parts in the broadcast, and something did go wrong. During the outro, when everyone gets up and dances around the Beatles as they play, someone bumps into Paul's mic. It swings away from him. You can hear him startled on the recording. He goes, "Whoa!" And this is the basis for one of the greatest mysteries in all of rock and roll history. To this day, we still don't know who sings "She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah" on All You Need Is Love. I am firmly in the camp of it being John, others say it's really Paul, but no one in the room that day seems to know. In the wake of all of this world-traveling, soul-searching, songwriting, drug-taking, and TV broadcasting, the Beatles' longtime manager Brian Epstein dies. George and Ringo had planned a trip for the Beatles and all of their wives, plus Patty's sister Jenny and their buddy Donovan, all to go to India to see the Maharishi. This trip is postponed. In an emergency meeting, the Beatles decide on two things. One, to try their hand at managing themselves. This leads to the ill-advised formation of Apple Corps and arguably sets off the domino effect that ends with the end of the Beatles. And number two, to go ahead with Magical Mystery Tour. It could be a way to work through their grief. Brian okayed the project before he died, and Paul really wanted to flex his skills as a film producer. They took another quick break from recording to attend Brian's funeral, and then to attend the How I Won the War premiere the very next day. Here's a wacky little piece of trivia to lighten the mood. The Eggman is Eric Burden of the Animals. He was into some freak shit, including cracking eggs over his partner's heads when they were doing the nasty. You're welcome, and I'm sorry. As for Magical Mystery Tour production, it was an unmitigated disaster the whole way through. None of the actors could improv. The bus got stuck in miles of traffic, meaning they couldn't even complete the tour. Both major studios in London were busy with Michael Caine and James Bond, respectively, so they go out to some air hangar in Kent to film. Editing was supposed to last just 1 week. It took 11. There were 10 hours of footage, but only about 50 minutes made the cut. Oof. And not to mention union issues plagued production the whole way through. The soundtrack was finally completed on November 7th. The last thing added was Paul's radio announcer style intro on the title track. The album, Magical Mystery Tour, goes as follows. Opening up side one, we have Magical Mystery Tour, followed by The Fool on the Hill. Then an instrumental interlude called Flying, followed by Blue Jay Way. Then Your Mother Should Know, and side one closes out with I Am the Walrus. Opening up side two, we have Hello Goodbye, then Strawberry Fields Forever, and Penny Lane. Next, Baby You're a Rich Man, and the album closes with All You Need Is Love. Magical Mystery Tour, the soundtrack, was released in the US in November of 1967, 5 months after Sgt. Pepper's. The film was broadcast the day after Christmas, and it was panned upon release. The BBC had royally fucked up, showing the thing in black and white, so it just looked shit. And it was a plotless disaster! No one knew what Magical Mystery Tour was about, not even the Beatles! The reviews from across the pond were so bad that NBC backed out of the US broadcast. And not even the nostalgia lens can help it. It's still reviewed poorly today, especially when you compare it to Yellow Submarine, which is just as delightfully weird but actually endearing. Shit. Am I gonna have to review Yellow Submarine? I'm gonna have to review Yellow Submarine. 20,000 subscribers, no, 25,000 subscribers, and I will review Yellow Submarine. The film, not the soundtrack. I don't want to touch the soundtrack. But as an album, somehow, Magical Mystery Tour did a lot better. It's an especially weird case of a US versus UK Beatle release. It was packaged as an LP in the US, like I have, and an EP in the UK, kind of like we had the Hey Jude EP over here. Even stranger, when the Beatles catalog was standardized for international universal release in the 80s to mirror what the Beatles had actually intended to be released. Stuff like the Beatles' first and second albums, Yesterday and Today, the Hey Jude EP, all of those went out of print. Magical Mystery Tour stayed. As whack as the film is, the songs on Magical Mystery Tour have had a massive cultural impact. The Our World broadcast with All You Need Is Love made history as the first international 5-continent, that is, live TV broadcast. Penny Lane has become a popular tourist trap in Liverpool and a portion of Central Park in New York City, where John lived with Yoko and Sean, was dubbed Strawberry Fields in his honor. There, you can visit his memorial. So, walruses, Eggmen, LSD, and film production disasters. What do I think of the music of Magical Mystery Tour? Magical Mystery Tour is a weird one. I can't measure its cultural impact as an album because it's a soundtrack. I can only assess the massive impact of certain individual songs. I can't analyze its sequencing. It's simply ordered by how the songs were ordered in the film. I can't even really analyze its significance in the Beatles canon because, well, it's not really a canon Beatles album. This thing existed to promote a movie, that which was a beautiful disaster, so you'd think it would be a hodgepodge of throwaways. In a sense, it is, but it's also really not. This is like a Whitman's box of everything the Beatles were playing around with in 1967. It's like a second course of Sgt. Pepper's. There are a couple glaring, repeated errors with the Magical Mystery Tour songs. 1, some songs fail to go anywhere. And 2, others are repetitive as hell. These are huge detractors for those who don't place Magical Mystery Tour in its context in Beatles history, but when you do, these flaws make total sense. These songs are half-baked because the guys were jetting all over the world, making 2 movies, promoting a mammoth of a record they'd put out just months before, and coping with the death of one of their closest confidants. With that in mind, let's evaluate Magical Mystery Tour. We start things off with the title track. Unfortunately, it's the weakest track here. There are some good ideas, sure, but each movement goes on just a smidge too long, and there aren't really enough lyrics to bolster these ideas besides "Roll up!" Then we have The Fool on the Hill, which, if you ask me, is the best Paul tune on here. It might be my favorite Paul tune across the entire Beatles discography. Around this period is where Paul cultivates what I feel makes him special as a writer. It's his sense of childlike wonder with a burgeoning wisdom, plus the comforting presence of a grandpa. Considering how big of a role the Fool played in this part of Beatles history, I wouldn't be surprised if The Fool on the Hill was inspired by these guys. Another one of my weird Beatles favorites is Flying. I don't know, I can't justify my like of this one. It's nothing more than an instrumental interlude. Its presence throws off the balance of Magical Mystery Tour as a package without having a second interlude on the B-side. But if you're a Wonderwall appreciator like me, then you see the beauty in this song. This is so much like the stuff that George would do for the Wonderwall soundtrack in '68, the non-Indian stuff, that is, which again, he worked on with The Fool. Speaking of George, Flying makes a kick-ass transition into Blue Jay Way. I love how dark Psych can get, and George was really in tune with that stuff. He flourished in late-stage Beatles. His quality of output was insanely high between 1968 and 1970. I feel Blue Jay Way is an indication of where the Beatles are headed in the year to come. Do I think this was intentional? No, but on a song like this, you can feel the clouds rolling in for arguably the darkest Beatles record. I Will Die on This Hill, Magical Mystery Tour, is more psychedelic than Sgt. Pepper's. The White Album, also more psychedelic than Sgt. Pepper's. Just when we start venturing into this murky, intriguing psych territory, we slam on the brakes with Your Mother Should Know. This is the weakest Paul track here. I'm sorry. It spins its wheels, but it doesn't really get anywhere. The momentum of all the preceding tracks just fizzles out with this one. So was the walrus John or Paul? Make up your fucking minds! This song is demented. It's deranged, unhinged, even. It just comes at you from all sides. And you might hate me for this, but I kind of love it. I literally can't justify it. It's nothing more than word salad, the ramblings of a man whacked out on the Cid. However nonsensical these lyrics are, corporation t-shirt, stupid bloody Tuesday, man you've been a naughty boy, you let your face grow long, is thought-provoking. Pretty little policemen in a row see how they fly is clever, and the chorus is hilarious. Good on George Martin for getting those Disney singers on board for this one. Their interjections really sell the song's atmosphere. It's accidental genius. Well done, Johnny boy. I like Hello Goodbye, even if, like the title track, it's repetitive as hell and just goes on a smidge too long. The difference with this one is it actually gets where it's going. Then we have what many have identified as the crown jewel of Magical Mystery Tour, Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. Strawberry Fields is one of the best songs John ever wrote. He did the existential and lost feeling so well. The time and key sig wonkiness is part of what makes this song so special to me. It's fun to listen to how different recordings address it. You have the anthology demo, the Sgt. Pepper's outtakes, the Cirque du Soleil version is my personal favorite. The lyrics are just open-ended enough to leave you wondering and wanting more. The composition is engaging, you have an iconic use of mellotron. This song is a source of intrigue, even today. Also, shout out to Todd Rundgren's cover on Faithful. If you've been around here, you know I am a Todd girly, and his cover of Strawberry Fields is one of my favorite moments on this one. As much as I respect those who go really hard for Strawberry Fields' inclusion on Sgt. Pepper's, I was once one of those people, we can't have Strawberry Fields without Penny Lane, and Penny Lane simply doesn't fit on Sgt. Pepper's. Just try to be unhappy while listening to Penny Lane. That's right, it's impossible. It's possible to romanticize any place when you listen to this. My first listen through of Magical Mystery Tour for this video was when I was walking my dog on a gray day. I found myself appreciating all the little things, the kids splashing in the swimming pool, or the lady working in her garden. Even the white trash with all their shit out on the lawn was beautiful. And Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane are two sides of the same coin. Both John and Paul are writing about home and what home means to them. Baby You're a Rich Man is my unlikely fave. This one snuck up on me. The use of mellotron throughout this soundtrack is a big component of what makes it so good musically. They're all so psych and fun, and Baby You're a Rich Man is no exception. But once again, we have that recurring problem with these songs. It's repetitive. Aside from these songs' repeated difficulty to just get where they're going, there's another error that I just can't ignore. It's an error by omission, and though it wasn't even in consideration to be on Magical Mystery Tour from my knowledge, I strongly feel it should have been. It's All Too Much was recorded during the Sgt. Pepper's sessions, but didn't make the cut for the final track listing. When the Beatles needed 4 new songs for the Yellow Submarine soundtrack, come '68, that one was thrown in. I feel comfortable taking the time to spotlight this song now, because truth be told, I probably won't ever cover the Yellow Submarine soundtrack on this channel. It's just not worth the time. It's All Too Much deserves this time because, if you ask me, it's one of the great underrated Beatles songs. It's one of George's best moments as a Beatle. This song, if it had been on here, it might not have been so underrated. It'd have fit in perfectly alongside Fool on the Hill, Flying, Blue Jay Way, Strawberry Fields, especially with the sound of Baby You're a Rich Man. In short, It's All Too Much is way too good to be relegated to Yellow Goddamn Submarine. And finally, All You Need Is Love. If I had to pick any song to represent the indomitable spirit of man, it would be this one. I won't say much on this song because everything that could be said about that song has already been said. The horns and orchestral arrangements are some of George Martin's finest. Other than that, I'll say that if All You Need Is Love doesn't move you, then you have a tuna casserole where your soul should be. Magical Mystery Tour and its soundtrack were very much a product of their time, don't get me wrong, but this body of work has got charm and such a sense of play. To write it off as a throwaway US album would be doing a disservice to all of the truly wonderful moments on here. While yes, there are some of the same issues cropping up on several tracks, I can forgive them. When you have such glaringly bright moments, such high highs as Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, All You Need Is Love, the undeniable cool of Blue Jay Way, and the mindfuck that is Walrus, they all far outweigh the lows, regardless of what you think of its place in Beatles history. Wherever you file this in your shelves, Magical Mystery Tour is fun. And fun is what this stage of the Beatles did best. For that reason, if you ask me, Magical Mystery Tour is a work of accidental greatness. My personal favorites are The Fool, Blue Jay Way, I Am the Walrus, Strawberry Fields Forever, and All You Need Is Love. Remember, if you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that is it. That was the soundtrack for Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles. What do you think of these songs? What do you think of the film? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums I love. And if you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!